The little German shepherd named Max sat trembling in the corner of the shelter. His ribs showed faintly beneath tangled fur, and his eyes shimmered with tears no one could explain. People passed him by, drawn to the happier dogs, none willing to take a chance on the broken one. Until a man and his young son stopped. The boy's right arm ended in a wooden prosthetic. The man hadn't planned to adopt. He only meant to look. "Hey, buddy," he whispered softly, kneeling beside the cage. Max hesitated, then slowly lifted one small paw through the cold metal bars, as if begging for one last chance. When their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them, quiet but powerful. Raymond, the veteran, didn't yet know that behind this fragile frame hid a secret that would soon leave an entire town speechless. That small act of compassion would become a story that healed two broken hearts and reminded everyone that love still finds its way, even in the unlikeliest places. Before we begin, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. It warms my heart to see how far these stories travel. Morning in the outskirts of Helena, Montana, began not with songbirds, but with the rattle of rain against tin roofs and the slow hum of trucks on wet asphalt. The town was half asleep, its diners flickering with pale neon, its gas stations breathing out the smell of diesel and coffee. Beyond the last intersection, past a chain-link fence draped with ivy and rust, stood the county animal shelter, a low, tired building crouched under the weight of gray clouds. The air smelled of disinfectant, wet concrete, and something softer, the faint scent of hope that still lingered between cages. Inside, rows of metal bars gleamed faintly in the weak light, each enclosing a life waiting to be noticed. In the farthest corner of the last corridor, where the bulbs flickered and the noise seemed to fade, a small German shepherd puppy sat pressed against the wall. He was barely 4 months old, all bone and breath, his fur dull and tangled with dirt, patches missing near his flank where hunger had taken hold. His ribs rose and fell like fragile wings beneath the skin. His eyes, dark brown and glistening, carried a sorrow far too old for something so young. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He simply trembled, as if every sound were a reminder of something cruel, and every passing shadow might bring another blow. To the volunteers, he was just another stray, rescued from an abandoned lot after a storm. But to anyone who looked closely, there was something different in his stillness. A quiet dignity, like he was waiting for someone he once knew and still believed would return. People came and went that morning, couples laughing softly as they peered into cages, families letting children point at wagging tails. The shelter's hum of voices rose and fell like a tide. But in that corner, the silence deepened. The little shepherd lowered his head, resting it on his paws, the weight of the world pressing down. He didn't know his name yet. He didn't know he was being watched. The door creaked open again near noon. A gust of cold wind followed a man and a boy inside, both carrying the quiet of those who had learned to live with loss. The man's name was Raymond Cole, early 50s, with weathered skin and a stillness that spoke of battlefields long behind him. His graying hair was cut close, his shoulders broad beneath a faded military field jacket, the kind that still smelled faintly of dust and pine. His eyes, blue and weary, scanned the corridor not with curiosity but caution, as if walking through a place that could break him all over again. Beside him walked Samuel, his 8-year-old son, small and thin, with eyes the color of rain-soaked slate. His right arm ended just below the elbow, replaced by a wooden prosthetic his father had carved himself. It was simple but sturdy, the grain of the pine polished smooth by time and use. Samuel carried it without shame, though his steps were careful, measured, like someone learning to move, through a world that had already taken more than it should. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The way he stayed half a step behind his father said everything. That silence between them was both shield and language. They hadn't meant to stop there. Raymond had been driving home from the hardware store when the shelter sign caught his eye. City Rescue, every life deserves a chance. He almost drove past, but something, a whisper from memory, a shadow named Rex, made him pull over. He told himself it would just be a quick look, maybe to show Samuel the dogs, maybe to fill the silence with something other than grief. But as he stepped into that corridor of cages, surrounded by hopeful eyes and wagging tails, he felt an ache rise behind his ribs, familiar and unwanted. He walked slowly, hands deep in his pockets, nodding at the volunteers, pretending he wasn't looking for anything at all. The dogs barked and leaped at the sight of him, their excitement bouncing off the metal bars, but Raymond's gaze drifted past them, searching for something he couldn't name. It wasn't until he reached the end of the hall that his steps faltered. There, half hidden in shadow, sat the trembling pup. No barking, no movement. Just those hollow eyes meeting his. Eyes that didn't ask to be saved, only to be seen. Raymond froze. The air between them shifted, like the world had drawn a breath and forgotten to exhale. He crouched slowly, knees cracking, the smell of rust and rain heavy in the air. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, his voice more breath than sound. The puppy flinched at first, then tilted his head, uncertain. Raymond didn't reach out. He knew better than to force trust. He just stayed there, close enough for warmth, far enough for safety. Minutes passed, the sound of other dogs fading into a distant hum. Then, with trembling effort, the pup lifted one paw and pressed it through the bars. The motion was small, hesitant, almost invisible, yet it landed like a strike to Raymond's chest. That single touch carried the weight of every loyalty he had ever lost, every brother, every dog, every promise buried in sand. His throat tightened. The world seemed to blur around that small connection, a man's scarred hand and a trembling paw meeting in the cold. From across the aisle, Samuel had stopped walking. He stood quietly, the sunlight catching on the varnish of his wooden hand. His face, pale and still, softened just a little. He didn't speak, but his gaze moved between the two, his father and the frightened animal. And he gave a small nod, barely perceptible, as if granting silent permission for something fragile to begin again. The shelter volunteer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, noticed from the counter. "That one?" she asked gently, stepping closer. "He doesn't eat much. Been scared since the day we found him." Raymond didn't answer right away. He only looked at the pup, at the way the tiny chest rose and fell, at the glimmer of defiance still alive behind fear. Finally, he murmured, "Yeah, that one." The woman smiled faintly, understanding more than he said. Papers rustled, signatures followed. The sky outside had cleared, leaving behind that pale blue calm that comes after rain. Later, as the sun dipped low and the town began to glow with warm windows and chimney smoke, Raymond carried the little shepherd wrapped in an old blanket to his truck. The puppy's body was stiff at first, but when the engine started and Samuel leaned close, whispering something too soft to hear, the trembling eased. The truck rumbled down the empty road toward the pine-covered hills. Three silhouettes outlined against the fading light. A father, a son, and the quiet shape of something like hope returning. That night, as the porch light flickered on, the blanket shifted and a small nose peeked out. A new name was spoken for the first time, low and steady. Max. The sound seemed to settle in the air, soft and certain. And though no one noticed, the puppy's tail moved. Not a wag, just a slow, uncertain twitch, like the beginning of a promise. The mountain rain came softly at first, a whisper on the tin roof, a rhythm steady and unhurried, like fingers drumming on an old hymn. The cabin leaned into it, timbers groaning, wind weaving through the cracks with a sound that was half sigh, half memory. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of pine smoke and damp wool. Shadows danced along the log walls where the firelight flickered, small and restless, just like the pup curled by the door. Max lay there, chestnut fur darkened by rain, his body tense, ears twitching at every creak and whisper the storm stirred. His eyes, wide and wary, caught the glow of the fire, as if trying to read the intentions of the room itself. Raymond moved quietly, the floorboards protesting under his boots. He poured water into an old tin bowl, its rim dented and worn from years of use, and set it near the hearth. Steam rose from his wet sleeves, the fabric clinging to his forearms. The veteran's hands, rough, steady, but gentle now, lingered a moment over the bowl before he straightened and turned toward the boy. Samuel sat cross-legged on the rug, his wooden arm resting against his leg, the other hand tracing idle circles in the dust. His face glowed faintly in the firelight, a look of quiet thoughtfulness softening his features. "He looks scared," the boy said after a while, his voice low and careful, as though afraid to break the spell of the room. Raymond nodded but said nothing. He crouched by the wood stove, feeding another piece of pine into the slow-burning fire. Sparks rose like golden moths, vanishing into the dark. For a moment, he watched them dance and disappear, and something in his chest ached. Not pain, exactly, but recognition. The rain grew heavier, thudding against the roof in uneven rhythms. Somewhere outside, a loose shutter banged, and Max flinched, pressing himself tighter to the door. His breath came quick and shallow. Raymond let out a long sigh. "He'll get used to it," he murmured, though the words were as much for himself as for the boy. Hours drifted by. The sound of the storm blurred into a lullaby. The fire sank lower, and the room settled into its own breathing. Samuel leaned closer to the flames, speaking softly now, his words tumbling out in half-remembered fragments. He told stories about Rex, the old K9 his father had once trained, the dog he could barely recall except through stories. "He used to bark when thunder came," the boy said, smiling faintly. "But Dad said he wasn't scared. He was warning the storm to stay outside." Raymond glanced at him, but didn't interrupt. The mention of Rex always stirred something that lingered behind his ribs, a space both full and empty. Max listened, head tilted, his ears flicking at every rise and fall of the boy's voice. Something in the tone, the rhythm, maybe, or the warmth, seemed to chip away at his fear. He lifted his head, sniffed the air, and slowly, hesitantly, crept closer. His nails clicked softly on the wooden floor as he crossed the small distance between them. Samuel froze, breath caught, not wanting to move too quickly. When Max reached him, he stopped, nose brushing the sleeve of the boy's flannel shirt. The fabric smelled of soap, pine, and the faint sweetness of the bread they'd eaten for supper. For a long moment, the world held still. The fire, the rain, even time itself seemed to listen. Then Max let out a small sigh, circled once, and lay down beside the boy, pressing his warm body against Samuel's leg. Raymond looked up from his chair, and something deep in him shifted. The sight was so ordinary, so gentle, it nearly undid him. He hadn't realized until that moment how loud silence had been in this house, how empty it had sounded every night since the war. Now, as the rain softened and the fire whispered, the hollow was filled, not by noise but by the simple sound of breathing, shared and steady. He leaned back, rubbing his temples, and let the quiet wrap around him. Outside, the storm rolled over the ridge, its growl fading into distance. The wind smelled of wet earth and cedar. Inside, Max slept lightly, paws twitching as if chasing something through dream. Samuel dozed too, his head tilted toward the dog, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. For a time, peace seemed not just possible but real. Then the thunder cracked. Sharp and sudden, a whip across the night. The window rattled, and Max's head shot up. His body stiffened, every muscle coiled, eyes wide with an old, buried terror. He scrambled to the window, barking into the blackness beyond the glass. At nothing, at everything, at ghosts only he could see. His voice, raw and desperate, filled the cabin, shattering the fragile stillness they had built. Raymond was on his feet before he thought, one hand raised, the other steady near the lamp. "Easy, Max," he said softly, his tone firm but kind. The dog ignored him, claws scraping at the wood, barking harder, as if trying to keep something unseen away. Samuel stirred, confused, calling his name. But Max's mind was elsewhere, somewhere deep and dark, where thunder wasn't just sound, but memory. And then, just as quickly as it began, the barking stopped. The dog stood panting, trembling, staring into the window pane where his own reflection looked back. Eyes wide, haunted. Lightning flashed once, painting his face in white light. For a heartbeat, Raymond saw not the frightened pup, but something older, something trained and broken by orders he couldn't yet understand. Outside, the storm continued its work, drumming against the earth. Inside, the air was heavy with the echo of what had been awakened. Fear, memory, or perhaps both. Raymond slowly sat down again, his breath steady, but his eyes still fixed on the window. Old fear had roots, and in that small cabin on the mountain, he knew they had only just begun to show. The first snow came early that year, a quiet kind of cold, soft enough to make the pines whisper but heavy enough to hide the world under white. Days bled into each other, each one marked by the rhythm of firewood and chores, by the muted company of a man, a boy, and a dog learning how to trust. Raymond split logs out back while Samuel stacked them neatly, his small hands clumsy but determined. Max lingered nearby, his breath puffing clouds into the frozen air, watching every swing of the axe with an alertness that never quite faded. When the echo of metal on wood died, he would nudge Samuel's elbow with his nose, tail low but wagging, as if making sure the boy was still all right. It was in those small exchanges that the house began to change. There were fewer silences now, and even the walls seemed to hold warmth longer. In the mornings, Max would follow Raymond into the shed, curling in a patch of sunlight while the veteran worked. The air there smelled of sawdust and iron, of oil and pine. Tools hung in neat rows, each one bearing years of use. Wrenches dulled by calloused hands. Nails sorted in jars labeled in Raymond's rough scrawl. It was the kind of order only soldiers and widowers ever truly kept. Precise, quiet, a language of control. And yet, it was in that order that something unexpected began to surface. One morning, while tightening a hinge, Raymond dropped a wrench. The sound cracked the air, sharp, metallic. Before he could reach down, Max was already there, picking it up in his mouth, carrying it back with such deliberate precision that Raymond froze mid-motion. "Where'd you learn that?" he muttered, half to himself. Max sat, tail thumping once, gaze steady. There was no playfulness in his eyes, only focus, waiting for the next command that never came. Raymond crouched, taking the wrench back slowly. His hand brushed against the dog's fur, and for the briefest second, the muscles beneath it trembled, trained to move, to act, to obey. After that, Raymond began to notice things. Subtle at first, almost unremarkable. The way Max would pause and listen when distant sirens drifted from town, his entire frame rigid, tail straight, eyes fixed toward the sound. The way he'd position himself between Samuel and the door whenever a stranger passed the property line. The way he never truly slept, only rested, always aware, as if his dreams were still full of orders. Each habit felt too deliberate to belong to an ordinary rescue dog. There was precision in the way he moved, and memory in the way he hesitated. One evening, while fixing the fence, Raymond tested a theory. He whistled low, a tone he hadn't used in years, one drilled into every K9 handler on base. Max's ears twitched instantly. He stood, head turning toward the sound, muscles tensing, waiting. Raymond froze. "No," he said softly, shaking his head, the word carrying more ache than command. "Not anymore." Max tilted his head, confused, then lowered himself back down, eyes searching the man's face for something he didn't understand. Raymond reached out and brushed his fur, whispering, "You don't have to be who they made you." Weeks turned into a slow thaw of trust, though a shadow lingered beneath the surface, a question neither of them could name. It wasn't until the day of the vet appointment that the answer began to take shape. The clinic sat at the edge of town, a small building painted blue, smelling faintly of antiseptic and hay. The veterinarian, Dr. Helen Ward, was a sturdy woman in her 40s with auburn hair tied back and lines of kindness at the corners of her eyes. She greeted them with a smile that reached her voice. "You've been feeding him well," she said, running practiced hands along Max's spine. "He's put on weight." Samuel watched from the chair, swinging his legs. Max stood calmly on the table, tail still, though his gaze followed Raymond wherever he moved. When Dr. Ward lifted the scanner and passed it along the dog's neck, the silence broke with a soft beep. She frowned, glanced at the monitor, then passed it again. The same sound. "Huh," she murmured. "Didn't expect that." Raymond stepped closer. "What is it?" She turned the screen toward him. A line of numbers blinked faintly. Kane, R37. "No name, no registered owner," she said, brows knitting. "Just this code. Military format, if I had to guess." Raymond's chest tightened. He recognized the pattern instantly. K9 identification, the kind used on trained service dogs. He swallowed, eyes tracing the old scar on Max's neck where the skin puckered slightly under the fur. "Could this have been removed?" he asked quietly. Dr. Ward nodded. "Possibly. Looks like someone tried." They drove home in silence, snow beginning to fall in fine, steady flakes that caught the headlights and turned the world into a tunnel of light. Samuel dozed in the back seat, his head resting against Max's flank, the rhythmic rise and fall of the dog's breathing steady as a metronome. Raymond's hands gripped the wheel tightly. The code looped in his mind. K9R37, over and over, like an echo from a past he'd buried but never forgotten. That night, the storm deepened. Inside the cabin, the fire glowed low, painting the room in gold and shadow. Raymond sat in his chair, staring at the flames, his thoughts heavy and restless. Max lay stretched beside the hearth, his head resting on Samuel's blanket. The boy slept soundly, a small smile curving his lips, one arm draped over the dog's side. Outside, the snow fell like ash, silent, endless, erasing tracks and memory alike. Raymond leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the flicker of firelight dancing in his tired eyes. He watched Max's chest rise and fall, saw the faint twitch of his ear, the restless dream beneath his fur. Then softly, almost as if afraid of the answer, he whispered into the quiet, "Who were you before you learned to be afraid?" The words hung in the air, fragile as snowflakes, before dissolving into the hush of winter. The storm began before dawn, not loud, but steady, a curtain of rain sweeping down the mountain as if the sky itself had forgotten how to stop grieving. Raymond stood by the window, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hand, eyes tracing the blur of pine silhouettes bending under wind. Behind him, the fire burned low, and Max slept near Samuel's feet, his body curled protectively around the boy like a living shield. The room smelled of wet wool and ash, the kind of scent that clings to memory long after it fades. The world outside was gray, quiet, waiting, and then the phone rang. He hesitated before answering. The line crackled faintly, a pause, then a voice, calm, official, threaded with a kind of rehearsed sympathy. "Mr. Cole, we're calling regarding the identification you submitted. The chip number K9R37 has been matched to a classified entry." Raymond's fingers tightened around the receiver. "Go on," he said quietly, though his throat felt dry. "R37 belonged to Rhea," the voice continued, "a military K9 who died protecting her handler during a raid 6 months ago. This pup, your dog, is the only recorded survivor of her litter." For a moment, all he could hear was the rain. The name hit like a pulse of thunder, Rhea. He remembered it from deployment reports, from radio chatter whispered between units, the way soldiers spoke of her, the dog who never broke command. She'd been the kind of legend that lived longer than men, the one even the hardest handler trusted with silence. Raymond closed his eyes, a flicker of the past bleeding through. A raid in sand and smoke, a handler carried out on a stretcher, and a dog's cry echoing through dust. He hadn't been there that day, but he remembered the story. They all did. Now her son lay at his feet. He turned, gaze falling on Max. The dog stirred lightly in his sleep, paws twitching as if chasing ghosts through dream. The firelight brushed over the faint scar along his neck, the one that once hid a code instead of a name. Raymond's chest tightened. This wasn't just chance, he thought. It was inheritance. Loyalty passed down through blood and fear and survival. He crouched, brushing his fingers through Max's fur. "You were born from courage," he whispered, though the words trembled. "And somehow, you found your way back to it." All day the house held a different kind of silence. Samuel sensed it, though he didn't ask. He sat near the hearth, sketching clumsy lines of a dog and a soldier beside a flag, his wooden hand resting still on the paper as he worked. Max stayed close to him, eyes following the boy's every move, tail thumping softly each time the pencil paused. Raymond kept busy, chopping wood, fixing hinges, anything that filled the space between thoughts. But every sound carried a shadow now. Each knock of the hammer, each creak of the boards seemed to whisper Ria's name. By evening, the rain had thickened into a downpour. The road outside vanished under mist. Raymond sat by the fire again, the phone call still looping in his head, the voice that had said she died protecting her handler. His own breath felt heavy, almost guilty, as if he'd inherited something he wasn't sure he deserved. He looked at Max, now awake, sitting upright and alert, his gaze fixed toward the window. "You remember her, don't you?" he murmured. The dog's ears flicked, head tilting slightly at the sound of his name. Raymond smiled faintly. "She'd be proud of you." The words barely left his lips when headlights cut through the rain outside, a glare too bright, too deliberate. The sound of tires grinding wet gravel followed, then the soft slam of a car door. Raymond rose, every instinct sharpened by old memory. Through the fogged glass, he saw a dark SUV idling in the driveway, its wipers slicing rhythmically through water. A figure emerged, tall, in a government-issued coat, hat low against the weather. The porch light caught the glint of a badge clipped to the breast pocket. He opened the door before the knock came. "Mr. Cole?" The man's voice was steady, polite but firm, the kind that had said the same line 100 times before. "I'm Agent Miller, National K-9 Recovery Program." His face was pale under the brim, mid-40s, eyes sharp but not unkind. Rain dripped from his coat as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a folder sealed in plastic. "We're here regarding the dog. Identification R37. Raymond didn't move. Behind him, Max stood, silent, tail low, but his body tense. "We'd like to reclaim him for service," the agent continued, tone carefully measured. "Given his lineage, his temperament, and the circumstances of recovery, R37 could be invaluable to active units." Raymond's jaw tightened. The room felt smaller suddenly, air thick. "He's not R37, he said, voice low. "He's Max." The agent hesitated, adjusting the brim of his hat. "With respect, sir, dogs like him were bred for purpose. They're not ordinary animals. He could save lives." From the corner of the room came the sound of movement, soft, deliberate. Samuel had risen from the rug, his small frame backlit by the fire. His wooden hand, carved smooth and pale, closed around Max's collar. The boy's eyes met the agent's, steady and clear in the dim light. "He's home," he said simply. No anger, no plea, just truth spoken without fear. The agent blinked, the firmness in his expression faltering for a moment. He looked from the boy to the man, then down at the dog, whose gaze had not left him. For a long time, the only sound was the rain on the roof, 1,000 small hands drumming out the rhythm of a choice. Finally, the agent nodded once, sliding the folder back into his coat. "Think about it," he said quietly. "We'll be in touch." He stepped off the porch, rain swallowing him whole as the SUV docker shut with a hollow thud. The headlights turned, then vanished into the dark road, leaving only the echo of tires and the ghost of a decision not yet made. Raymond closed the door slowly, the latch clicking into place like a final word. The fire popped behind him, and Max pressed closer to Samuel's side, ears twitching at the fading thunder. The veteran stood there a long time, hand on the doorknob, listening to the sound of rain against the wood, steady, relentless, like the past refusing to stay buried. And though the cabin was warm, he could feel it. The knock hadn't really left. It had just gone quiet. waiting for the next storm. The spring sun stretched low across the rooftops, soft and forgiving, gilding the puddles left behind by last night's rain. The world looked gentle again, children's laughter echoing near the bakery, wind chimes whispering above old porches, the town breathing in rhythm with its hills. Raymond and Samuel walked home from the Saturday market, their bags heavy with bread and apples, the scent of soil and morning clinging to their sleeves. Max trotted beside them, head high, tail flicking in contentment, his ears twitching to every small sound. A sparrow's wing, a car's hum, the steady beat of his boy's footsteps. They passed the old service station at the curve, the one where the road narrowed toward the bridge. The air carried a faint tang of oil and exhaust. Then Max stopped, just stopped. His body stiffened, muscles tight, nostrils flaring. Raymond almost stumbled into him. "What is it, boy?" The question was barely out before Max barked once, sharp, urgent. Across the street, smoke curled from beneath the hood of a parked sedan. At first it seemed harmless, the kind of sputter engines made on wet mornings, until a muffled pounding echoed from inside. A child's cry, faint, trapped, terrified. A small hand struck the window glass, then another. Time fractured. Raymond's bags dropped, fruit scattering across the asphalt. Samuel froze, his heart slamming against his ribs. Max barked again, circling once before dashing toward the car, paws splashing through the shallow gutter. Raymond's instincts caught up a second later. "Stay here," he shouted to Samuel, though the boy was already moving. He tore off his jacket, running. The smell of burning rubber hit first, then the sight. Flames blooming beneath the dashboard, small but growing, hungry. Max reached the car door, barking furiously, the sound raw and echoing. He jumped against the window, teeth bared, claws scraping the glass. Not from aggression, but urgency. The sound of command, of warning. The child inside turned toward him, coughing through the haze. Raymond arrived an instant later, the fire's heat licking at his face. He wrapped his jacket around his arm and swung hard. The window shattered, shards raining over the seat. Smoke billowed out in thick, choking waves. "Easy, I've got you," Raymond rasped, reaching in. The boy's sobs were lost in the roar of flame. Max barked again, then pressed his body against Raymond's leg, guiding his movement. His teeth caught the edge of the child's sleeve, not pulling hard, just anchoring, helping Raymond lift the small body free. For a moment, man and dog moved as one, an instinctive rhythm older than thought. Together, they staggered back just as the front seat ignited with a thunderous crack. The blast of heat knocked them to their knees. The car was swallowed in fire, orange tongues clawing toward the sky. Raymond shielded the child beneath his arms. Max stood before them, panting, eyes wide but unflinching. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, weaving through the stunned murmurs of bystanders who had begun to gather. Some filmed, others shouted, but all of them watched. A soldier, a boy, and a dog standing against the blaze. When the paramedics arrived, Raymond handed the trembling child to a woman whose voice broke into sobs of relief. He turned to Max, who now sat beside Samuel, tail thumping weakly against the pavement. "You did good," Raymond whispered, his voice thick. Samuel's wooden hand stroked Max's head, and for a moment, nothing existed but the quiet between heartbeats, the sound of gratitude, alive and breathing. An hour later, the fire trucks rolled away, leaving only smoke and the scent of melted plastic. The street emptied, cameras packed up, reporters chasing stories down to headlines. The world seemed to exhale again until the low hum of another engine rose behind them. Raymond looked up. A black SUV pulled to the curb, its surface glistening with reflected firelight. He didn't need to see the badge to know. Agent Miller stepped out first, raincoat dark, expression unreadable. But it was the second figure who drew every breath from the street. The man who followed was older, taller even in his limp, his right leg braced by a cane carved from oak. His hair was gray, cropped close, his jaw lined with quiet resolve. When his gaze met Max's, the noise of the world fell away. "Sergeant Collins," Miller said softly, almost reverently. "Ria's handler." The veteran stood before the dog for a long time, saying nothing. Then slowly he knelt, one knee pressing against the cracked asphalt. The cane leaned beside him, his gloved hand reaching out, shaking slightly as it found Max's head. The German shepherd tilted forward, eyes gentle, tail sweeping the ground. Collins drew in a long breath, and when he spoke, his voice broke like something sacred giving way. "You've got her courage," he whispered. "Her eyes, too." Raymond watched, a soldier recognizing another soldier's grief, a legacy reborn not in command, but in compassion. Samuel stood close, his small hand still resting on Max's collar. The light from the dying fire shimmered in their eyes, turning the smoke into gold. When Collins rose again, his hand lingered on Max's shoulder. "You gave him back to the world," he said quietly, "and maybe that's what she always meant for him to do." No one replied. There was no need. The silence said enough, the kind that doesn't demand words because truth had already spoken. The SUV's door shut with a muted click. As it rolled away, the reflection of its taillights streaked across the puddles like a closing chapter. Raymond looked down at Max, who pressed against Samuel's side, content, calm, alive. Somewhere above the rooftops, the clouds parted, and sunlight broke through again. Soft, golden, forgiving. The morning of the ceremony arrived soft and golden, sunlight spilling across the cobblestones like the town itself had decided to breathe easier. Banners fluttered along the square, their edges catching the spring wind, and somewhere a brass band warmed its instruments. Tentative notes that wove through the smell of coffee, lilacs, and fresh paint. People gathered early, families with folded programs, veterans in pressed jackets heavy with medals, children perched on their fathers' shoulders. At the center stood a small stage framed by wooden beams and bunting, and above it, a simple banner rippled in the breeze. Its words shimmered beneath the light. "Hero of Hope, K9 Max." Raymond stood just below it, straight-backed but uneasy in the crowd's gaze. His field jacket was cleaner now, but still bore the faint scars of use, the kind that couldn't be ironed away. Beside him, Samuel fidgeted, his wooden prosthetic resting against his leg, his free hand buried in Max's fur. Max sat between them, still and proud, a plain blue collar around his neck instead of a service tag. His coat glowed in the morning sun, chestnut and sable hues flickering like living bronze. When someone in the crowd whistled and called his name, Max's ears perked, tail giving a small, polite wag, as if even in glory, he preferred modesty. The mayor stepped forward, a broad man in his 60s. Gray hair swept neatly back, his suit too warm for the day, but his tone kind and steady. He spoke of bravery and belonging, of how courage was not just found on battlefields, but in quiet acts that asked for nothing in return. Then he turned to Raymond. "Sergeant Cole," he said, "would you like to say something?" For a moment, Silence pressed between the heartbeat of the band's last note and the murmur of the crowd. Raymond looked down at his boots, then at the dog sitting faithfully beside him. He cleared his throat, voice rough from years of disuse. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the rooftops. "I thought I was the one who saved him, but the truth is, he saved us." The words hung there, fragile yet undeniable, and the world seemed to pause to let them settle. Then came the sound, not of polite applause, but of something deeper. The rustling of hundreds of hands clapping slowly, reverently, like rain on church windows. Samuel smiled shyly. Max tilted his head at the noise, unsure whether this too was part of duty. Raymond reached down, resting a hand over the boy's shoulder, and the crowd's cheers rose higher. Cameras flashed, but for once the light didn't feel invasive. It felt earned. Afterward, when the people began to drift away, to cars, to cafes, to the rest of their small-town lives, the three of them lingered near the stage. Sergeant Collins approached briefly, cane tapping softly against the stones. He didn't speak long, just a nod toward Max, a faint smile breaking through his weathered face. "She'd be proud," he said, meaning Rhea, meaning all the dogs that had run before and never come back. Raymond nodded once, his jaw set in that way men do when gratitude threatens to undo them. By evening, the square had emptied, leaving only echoes of laughter and stray petals from bouquets tossed onto the stage. The road home stretched quiet beneath their feet, the sun already sinking behind the ridge. At the cabin, the smell of pine and old firewood welcomed them back. Max circled once near the hearth, before curling down, his body fitting perfectly against the rug where Rex's shadow once slept. Samuel leaned into his father, head resting on his shoulder, the rhythm of his breathing slow and content. The firelight danced across the room, painting the walls in soft amber hues. Outside, crickets began their nightly chorus, an orchestra for a piece too delicate to name. Raymond sat still for a long time, one hand absently stroking Max's fur, the other resting on Samuel's back. There was nothing left to fight, nothing left to prove. Just the quiet and the steady warmth of life finding its way back to them. He leaned forward slightly, voice barely above the crackle of the fire. "Rest now, soldier," he whispered. "You're home." Max's tail tapped softly against the wooden floor, once, twice, 3 times, a rhythm that felt like memory, like gratitude, like the heartbeat of every loyal soul that had ever waited for dawn. Outside, the night deepened, wrapping the cabin in its calm. And somewhere beyond it all, beneath stars that had watched too many wars and too many healings, the sound of peace finally stayed. Some stories don't end when the mission does. They linger, not in medals or banners, but in the quiet moments after, when the world finally exhales. Maybe that's what courage really is. Not the roar of battle, but the whisper that follows it. The soft sound of a heart still choosing kindness, even after everything it's lost. Tonight, somewhere out there, another soul will bend to tie a collar, or open a shelter gate, or whisper a word to a frightened animal that still believes the world can be gentle. And maybe, just maybe, that small act will save them both. Because loyalty doesn't fade, it simply changes shape, from a bark in the dark, to a hand reaching out, to the warmth of a fire that never quite goes out. So if you ever hear silence after a storm, listen closely. You might find a little courage still breathing there, waiting, quietly, to come home.